Welcome back everyone. So we'll be continuing our classes. Inheritance and variation chapter. We're still on inheritance and variation. Okay. So last class we have discussed sex determination in men, and we have seen the differences between sex chromosome and autosomal chromosome. In this class we will discuss a new topic, chromosomal theory of inheritance. Chromosomal theory of inheritance. Okay, we will discuss chromosomal theory of inheritance. Okay, this theory is nothing but interpretation of Mendels' work with chromosome. Okay, so this theory was proposed by two scientists, Sutton and Boveri. Chromosomal theory of inheritance was proposed by two scientists, Sutton and Boveri, and this theory is the interpretation of Mendels' work with chromosome. That means, what did Mendel say in his experiment? Mendel said that in our body there is something unit. He called it as a factor, right? Something unit that is passed from generation to generation, but he was unable to show the actual structure of gene. He just gave us the idea that in our cell there is something that is passed from generation to generation. Okay, but he was unable to show the structure, the actual structure of gene. Why? Because at that time there was no well developed microscope. Okay, so later on Sutton and Boveri found out that, because by that time when Sutton and Boveri discovered this theory, by that time the well developed microscope was already discovered, invented. Okay, so that they can see actual structure of cell, the actual structure of chromosome and all. So they were able to see the structure, what is there in our cell. What is that structure is in our cell, and it is passed from generation to generation. Okay, so they found out that actually there is a chromosome, and the gene is located on that chromosome, and it is passed from generation to generation. Okay, तो यहाँ पे हम लोग जीन जो मेंडल ने डिस्कवर किया था, जीन एंड सटन एंड बोवेरी क्रोमोसोम, we will compare. Okay, हम लोग यहाँ पे क्रोमोसोम और जीन को compare करेंगे. So that this theory means just interpretation of Mendel's work. Okay, so for that we need to know some basic things. Okay, we need to go back Mendel's work. So when Mendel, in which year Mendel published his work? Mendel published his work in the year 1865. His work. So in the year of 1865, Mendel published his work, okay, in a book called Experiment on Plant Hybrid. We have already discussed this in our first class of this chapter, but still we need to see the Mendel's work here also. So in 1865 ने Mendel अपना experiment propose किया था, but his work was not recognized by the biologist, right? We have seen the reason behind that also in the first class. So why his work was not recognized at that time? Because the first thing he said that there's a factor. He was a mathematician by professional. Okay, by profession he was a mathematician. He was not a biologist actually. So he called that in our body there is a unit, something. He just put out some imaginary thing. तो एक इमेजिन करके मेंडल ने बोला था कि कुछ है हम लोग का बॉडी में जो जेनरेशन टू जेनरेशन पास होता है, लेकिन वो जीन का स्ट्रक्चर he was unable to show the structure of gene. Okay, क्यों? क्योंकि उस टाइम में माइक्रोस्कोप डेवलप नहीं थे, हाई लेवल माइक्रोस्कोप डेवलप नहीं थे, तो स्ट्रक्चर देखने के लिए ऐसा कुछ माइक्रोस्कोप नहीं थे. So that's why he was unable to show the physical evidence. That's why biologists did not accept his work. To accept something imaginary thing that is inherited from generation to generation, it was difficult for the biologists to accept. That was the first reason. Second reason क्या थे जो मेंडल का वर्क रिकॉग्नाइज नहीं किया? सेकेंड रीज़न था कि उस ज़माने में इंटरनेट हो या न्यूज़पेपर वेल डेवलप मैगज़ीन ऐसा कुछ नहीं थे. तो आजकल का ज़माने में जैसा यूट्यूब है, गूगल है, उस ज़माने में ऐसा नहीं थे. तो जो उसका वर्क जो उन्होंने पब्लिश किया तो कुछ सर्टेन एरिया तक से पहुँचे. ठीक है, होल वर्ल्ड में वो उसका काम को वर्ल्ड वर्ल्ड में जाना नहीं गए. क्यों? उस टाइम में ऐसा इंटरनेट हो या कुछ न्यूज़पेपर हो ऐसा वेल डेवलप नहीं थे. सो देयर वाज इज अनदर रीज़न फॉर हिज फेलियर, राइट? सो आफ्टर हिज डेथ 16 years after his death after 16 years of his death in the year 1900, three scientists rediscovered Mendel's work. Okay, three scientists फिर से मेंडल्स का काम को पढ़ाई किया, उसका एक्सपेरिमेंट को फिर से वो लोग एग्जामिन किया. बाद में पता चला कि मेंडल जो बोल रहा एक्चुअली दैट वाज ऑल ट्रू. सो इन 1900 three scientists, Charmark, Correns. Okay, these things we have already discussed, but in this topic, when we study this topic, these things we need to remember. So Charmark, Correns, and Hugo de Vries rediscovered his work and found out that what the Mendel was explaining, it was actually a truth about inheritance. Okay. But Mendel was unable to show the structure of gene because at that time there was no well-developed microscope. He just put up some imaginary unit, okay, something that is passed from generation to generation. Now, in the year 1902, two scientists, Sutton and Boveri, discovered chromosomal theory of inheritance. Okay, and these two scientists said that the genes are located on a chromosome itself and is passed from generation to generation. So Mendel was unable to show the structure of gene and structure of chromosome or any structure in a cell, inside a cell, because there was no well-developed microscope. But by time 1902, the microscope was already developed. High-level microscope was already developed. Microscope थे उस ज़माने में, लेकिन high develop नहीं थे. Okay, मतलब high level वाला microscope नहीं थे. तो by 1902, the microscope, high-level microscope was already developed. So Sutton and Boveri was able to see the structure of the cell, what is there inside the cell, what passed from generation to generation. So Sutton and Boveri found out that inside our cell during gamete formation there is a chromosome actually. Okay, chromosome, and that chromosome is passed from generation to generation along with the genes. Okay, because genes are located on a chromosome itself. समझ में आया? Now we need to compare Mendel's gene with, we won't call it as a gene. Okay, Mendel unable to show the structure of gene, he just call it as a factor, so we will call that factor. So in this topic we will compare the Mendel's factor, that is gene, later on, which was proposed by other scientists, right? So Mendel factor and chromosomal theory of Sutton and Boveri. So gene और chromosome का compare करेंगे ये चैप्टर ये टॉपिक में. ठीक है, मेंडल्स का जीन और सटन एंड बोवेरी का क्रोमोसोम थ्योरी ऑफ इनहेरिटेंस. इनहेरिटेंस मतलब क्या है? इनहेरिटेंस मतलब पास्ट फ्रॉम जनरेशन टू जनरेशन. इनहेरिट, जो जीन हम लोग एक्वायर्ड करते हैं, इनहेरिट करते हैं फ्रॉम आवर पेरेंट्स, वही हम लोग जीन हम लोग का ऑफस्प्रिंग को पास करेंगे, वही इनहेरिटेंस बोलते हैं. ठीक है, इनहेरिटेंस मतलब सिंपल वर्ड दैट इज पास फ्रॉम जनरेशन टू जनरेशन. ओके, सो chromosomal theory of inheritance. So chromosome pass from generation to generation. So these are the things that you need to understand. Okay, so in 1865, Mendel published his work in a book called Experiment on Plant Hybrid. We have already discussed. So, but till his death, Mendel work was not recognized. The reason behind that, because Mendel called gene as a factor or discrete unit that is passed from generation to generation, but he was unable to show the physical evidence of gene. So that's why biologists did not accept his work. Second reason can be, so during at that time there was no well developed internet or any newspaper which can pass all over the country, all over the world. Okay, again during that time many biologists was busy on Darwin's theory, so they did not give much attention to Mendel's work. Okay, so later on in 1902, Sutton and Boveri discovered chromosomal theory of inheritance and found out that it is actually a chromosome where the genes are located and is passed from generation to generation. Okay, so we will compare Mendel's factor or gene along with the chromosomal theory of Sutton and Boveri. Mendel's factor. So we will call it as a factor, okay? Because Mendel called gene as a factor. So जीन को कौन दिया नाम, बाद में जीन को नाम दिया जोहानसन साइंटिस्ट ने, लेकिन मेंडल जीन का स्ट्रक्चर को आइडेंटिफाई नहीं कर सके. क्यों? क्योंकि उस ज़माने में माइक्रोस्कोप, वेल डेवलप्ड माइक्रोस्कोप नहीं थे. ओके, सो मेंडल कॉल जीन एज अ फैक्टर, सो वी विल कॉल इट एज अ फैक्टर बिकॉज वी आर कंपेयरिंग मेंडल्स वर्क. ओके, एंड chromosomal theory of Sutton and Boveri. Now in exam, if the question asks, compare the behavior between the gene and the chromosome, so you can go with that. ऐसा भी पूछ सकते हैं. So compare the, ऐसा actual question नहीं पूछ के, exactly ऐसा नहीं पूछ के, so compare the behavior of genes and a chromosome, ऐसा भी पूछ सकते हैं. और like compare the Mendel's factor with Sutton and Boveri chromosomal theory of inheritance. Okay, ऐसा भी पूछ सकते हैं. और ऐसा भी पूछ सकते हैं, what are the features of chromosomal theory of inheritance. So अगर chromosomal theory of inheritance का features पूछते हैं तो सिर्फ chromosomal theory of inheritance का features लिखना. Okay, ये दोनों का compare करने का जरूरी नहीं है. Okay, so first thing, so what did Mendel say? Mendel called gene as a discrete unit or factor. He just gave us some imaginary thing that is passed from generation to generation, because he was a mathematician by profession, so he called it as a unit, something unit that is passed from generation to generation. Okay, बुझी पाइसा? Okay, so Mendel called gene as a factor. हम लोग फैक्टर भी बोल सकते हैं. हम लोग मतलब मेंडल ने बोला तो मेंडल ने फैक्टर भी बोला और डिस्क्रिमिनेट यूनिट भी बोले, तो वी कैन जस्ट call it as a factor, or we can call it as a discrete unit. So Mendel called gene as a factor or discrete unit. Mendel's called gene as a factor or discrete unit which pass from generation to generation. Okay, इसीलिए उसका थ्योरी को एक्सेप्ट नहीं किया गया साइंटिस्ट. क्यों? क्योंकि मेंडल ने जस्ट एक इमेजिनरी थिंग पुट किया कि कुछ है हम लोग का बॉडी में जो पास होते हैं जनरेशन टू जनरेशन. तो कुछ भी हो इमेजिनरी हम लोग एक्सेप्ट तो नहीं कर सकते हैं ना. जब तक एक्चुअल स्ट्रक्चर को ना देख ले तब तक तो हम लोग एक्सेप्ट नहीं कर सकते हैं कि नहीं. So that's why his work was not recognized. But we can appreciate that Mendel gave us some idea about inheritance, right? So later on in 1902, by that time, the microscope, well-developed microscope was already developed. So the structure, what is there inside the cell, the structure could able to see by Sutton and Boveri. So Sutton and Boveri found out that actually not only gene, there is a chromosome also, and the genes are located on the chromosome and is passed from generation to generation. Okay, chromosome discover किया, ओके, सतन एंड बोबरी, और क्या बोले, क्रोमोसोम में ही जीन रहते हैं और साथ में जनरेशन टू जनरेशन ट्रेवल करते हैं. ओके, सो सटन एंड बोवेरी discovered chromosomal theory of inheritance and genes are located on a chromosome and is passed from generation to generation. Okay, so Sutton and Boveri said that the genes are located on a chromosome itself and it travels generation to generation. Or you can modify your sentence, अपना खुद का sentence भी language भी use कर सकते हो. It is inherited from generation to generation भी लिख सकते हो. It is passed from generation to generation भी लिख सकते हो. Okay, so Sutton and Boveri discovered chromosomal theory of inheritance, and the genes are located on a chromosomes and is passed and is inherited from generation to generation. अपना language use करो, ठीक है? Exactly मेरे जैसे लिखना जरूरी नहीं है. If you understood, you can write your own language, but it should be to the point. There should be a point which is necessary. Okay. So पहले तो मेंडल ने क्या किया? मेंडल ने बोला कि कुछ हम लोग का बॉडी में कुछ है, ओके, तो पास होता है जनरेशन टू जनरेशन. सो एक्चुअल में क्या होते हैं? क्रोमोसोम होते हैं. ओके, दैट इज पास फ्रॉम जनरेशन टू जनरेशन. सो जीन्स आर लोकेटेड ऑन द क्रोमोसोम ओनली. सो इट वाज गिवन बाय सटन एंड बोवेरी. सो नेक्स्ट थिंग व्हाट मेंडल सेड in his theory, Mendel said that the genes or the factor, we should say factor, okay, we should call it as a factor because Mendel called it as a factor. Gene was given by another scientist, Johansen, remember. So Mendel said that the factors always remains in pairs, हमेशा पेयर में रहते हैं वो जीन. So next thing, Mendel said the factor or discrete unit, the factors, Mendel said the factors always remain in pairs. वो हमेशा पेयरिंग में रहते हैं. हाँ, अगर जीन्स पेयर में रहते हैं तो क्रोमोसोम भी पेयर में रहेंगे, क्योंकि जीन्स तो कहाँ रहते हैं? जीन्स क्रोमोसोम में ही रहते हैं. ओके, so Sutton and Boveri, what it said? Sutton and Boveri also said that chromosome remains in pairs. Okay, so chromosome भी पेयर में रहते हैं. क्यों? क्योंकि क्रोमोसोम में ही जीन है. ये हो गया हम लोग का क्रोमोसोम. So Sutton and Boveri said that they always remain in pairs. हम लोग को पता है कितना पेयरिंग है हम लोग का बॉडी में, हम लोग का सेल में. How many pairs of chromosomes are there in our cell? We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? We have already discussed last class. 23 पेयर, 22 पेयरिंग को क्या बोलते हैं? ऑटोसोमल क्रोमोसोम. 23 नंबर वाला पेयरिंग को क्या बोलता है? सेक्स क्रोमोसोम और एक्स लिंक क्रोमोसोम. Why? In human, because it determines the sex of the offspring. We have already discussed. 23 number wala. So it always remain in pairs. Now inside the chromosome there is a gene. So gene chromosome में ही रहते हैं. For example A, B, okay. So they always remain in pairs. ये जीन है, इसका जो होमोलोगस जीन होते हैं उसको हम लोग एलील बोलते हैं. एलील याद करो फर्स्ट क्लास. एलील इज द अल्टरनेट फॉर्म ऑफ जीन. उसका जो होमोलोगस पेयरिंग होते हैं जीन का उसको हम लोग एलील बोलते हैं. ओके, रिमेंबर दैट दिस आर द बेसिक थिंग्स यू शुड नो. और उसका लोकेशन को क्या बोलते हैं? द जीन्स विच आर लोकेटेड ऑन ए क्रोमोसोम इज नोन एज व्हाट? उसका पोजीशन, जीन का पोजीशन, जो पोजीशन होते हैं क्रोमोसोम में उसको हम लोग क्या बोलते हैं? लोसाई, LOCI और लोकाई. So I think you know all those things, right? So next, what did Mendels say in his experiment? So he said that the factors always remain in pairs. Satano and Bobry also said that the chromosome remains in pairs. Ultimately because genes are located on the chromosome itself only. So अगर जीन पेयरिंग में है तो क्रोमोसोम भी पेयरिंग में होगा क्योंकि साथ में रहता है जीन और क्रोमोसोम. लेकिन मेंडल ने क्रोमोसोम को स्ट्रक्चर को नहीं दिया. ओके, मेंडल हैव नॉट सेड एनीथिंग अबाउट क्रोमोसोम. ही जस्ट कॉल जीन. ओके, क्रोमोसोम को कौन बोला? सतान एंड बबरी. ओके, नेक्स्ट. During gamete formation, the factors separate. जब गैमेट फॉर्मेशन होता है तब दोनों जीन का सेपरेशन होते हैं. ओके, so it was said by Mendel. Same thing will happen here also. During gamete formation, the chromosome separates. जब क्रॉसिंग ओवर होते हैं गैमेट फॉर्मेशन का टाइम में, क्रॉसिंग ओवर जब होते हैं तब जीन सेपरेट होते हैं. ठीक है, साथ में क्रोमोसोम भी सेपरेट होते हैं. फर्स्ट ईयर में है सेल साइकिल एंड सेल डिवीजन. मियोसिस का जो स्टेज होते हैं, पेकाइटिन, मियोसिस 1 का जो पेकाइटिन स्टेज होते हैं वहाँ पे क्रॉसिंग ओवर होते हैं. तब एक्सचेंज ऑफ जीन टेक्स प्लेस होते हैं, क्रोमोसोम एक्सचेंज होते हैं. आई डोंट नो इफ़ यू रिमेंबर और नॉट. ओके, सो अगर जीन सेपरेट होते हैं तो अल्टीमेटली क्रोमोसोम भी सेपरेट होंगे. ओके, तो सो यू राइट इट डाउन. ओके, सो ड्यूरिंग गैमेट फॉर्मेशन chromosome also separates. One more point. The factors. So I will call it as a factors here because we are discussing Mendels. Okay, जीन लिख सकते हैं लेकिन appropriate नहीं होंगे. ठीक है, क्यों? क्योंकि जीन तो मेंडल ने डिस्कवर नहीं किया. सो जीन वाज डिस्कवर्ड बाय अनदर साइंटिस्ट. मेंडल जस्ट कॉल इट एज देयर इज समथिंग यूनिट. ओके, सो आई विल कॉल इट एज अ फैक्टर्स. तो एप्रोप्रिएट होंगे फैक्टर्स बोलने से. सो फैक्टर्स सो इंडिपेंडेंट assortment. We have already discussed this. Mendel's law of inheritance में जो थर्ड लॉ है, मेंडल लॉ ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंट एजॉर्टमेंट, वो हमें पढ़े कि जीन एक जीन अपना इंडिपेंडेंट एजॉर्टमेंट शो करते हैं. व्हाट इज दैट मीन? सपोज वी हैव दिस जीन, ये इसका एलिलिक फॉर्म है, ये इसका एलिलिक फॉर्म है. मतलब हर जीन पेयर में रहते हैं. ठीक है, पेयर, उसका जो अनदर पेयर होता है उसको हम लोग एलील बोलते हैं. जीन का जो अलग उसका एक पेयर होता है, अनदर पेयर, उसको हम लोग एलील बोलते हैं. एलील. सो वी कॉल इट एज ए अल्टरनेट फॉर्म ऑफ जीन. ओके, सो दिस जीन, सपोज दिस जीन कैपिटल A here, it shows it adjourt independently. ओके, एजॉर्ट ये इसके साथ भी क्रॉस कर सकते हैं, इसके साथ भी क्रॉस कर सकते हैं. तो अगर इसके साथ क्रॉस करते हैं तो कैपिटल A कैपिटल B शो करेंगे, इसके साथ होता है कैपिटल A स्मॉल b. सो दे शो इंडिपेंडेंट एजॉर्टमेंट. इसको ही इंडिपेंडेंट एजॉर्टमेंट बोलते हैं. सेम थिंग स्मॉल a कैपिटल B स्मॉल a स्मॉल b. ओके, सो दे can adjort independently. Genes can adjort independently. We have already discussed this in Mendel's law of inheritance. Similarly, chromosomes also shows independent adjortment. Okay, that's it. So 4 points I'll give you. So if the question asks, write the silent features of chromosomal theory of inheritance. So point wise में ऐसा लिख दो. Question पूछने से ज़्यादा तक 2 marks नहीं तो 3 marks के लिए पूछेंगे. The question can be asked like that. Describe the salient features of chromosomal theory of inheritance. ठीक है? So लिख देना. सिर्फ इसको लिखना. If the question asks like that. If the question asks, describe the behaviors or compare the behaviors of gene and the behaviors of chromosome. So you make a chart like that. Whenever question asks, write the differences or differentiate between. Always make a chart. Don't write in a sentence wise. Okay? जब भी question पूछते हैं difference लिखने का तो हमेशा chart बनाना. अगर 2 marks का है question तो at least minimum 3 point लिखो. Okay, you can write up to 4 point maximum if it is 2 mark और पूछने से 2 mark ही पूछेंगे ज़्यादा नहीं. So write maximum 4 point, minimum 3 points. 2 point लिखोगे 2 marks का तो marks full marks मिलने का 50% chances रहते हैं. वो depend करेगा examiner का mood पे. लेकिन 3 point 4 point लिखते हो तो full mark मिलने का chances रहते हैं. ठीक है? So remember that. Or one more point, remember, do not repeat the same point again and again. Okay, when you compare those two characters, this character should be related with this character and don't compare the same sentence again. Okay, so be careful and write in a specific manner so that you get full marks. Okay, so if the question asks, differentiate the behaviors of genes and the chromosomal. So you compare like this. So these are the chromosomal theory of inheritance. Chromosomal theory of inheritance is nothing but the interpretation of Mendel's work with chromosome. So in 1865, Mendel published his work on experiment on plant hybrid. But till his death, his work was not recognized. So after his death, 16 years later, 3 scientists rediscovered his work in the year 1900. Remember that 3 scientists' name. Okay. The reason behind the Mendel work was not recognized because he called it as a Mendel called gene as a factor or something discrete unit which is passed from generation to generation. He was unable to show the physical evidences to the biologist. So biologists did not accept his work. Something to accept something imaginary thing which is passed from generation to generation, so it was hard to believe for the biologist. Okay, so he was also a mathematician by profession, so it was hard for the biologist to accept that someone mathematician is explaining biological work. And also during at that time all the biologists were busy on Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory में बहुत busy थे उस time में. Okay, इसलिए his work was not recognized. Okay, his work was not given much attention that time. Darwin's theory next chapter, evolution chapter में पढ़ेंगे, not next, evolution chapter में पढ़ेंगे, ठीक है? So Mendel said that there's something, gene which is passed from generation to generation. Okay. So during 1902, Sutton and Boveri gave a chromosomal theory of inheritance because by that time the well-developed microscope was already discovered, so they were able to see the actual structure which is there inside the cell that is passed from generation to generation. So Sutton and Boveri found out that all the genes are located on a chromosome and it is actually a chromosome that is passed from generation to generation or that is inherited from generation to generation. So we compare Mendel's factor along with the chromosome by Sutton and Boveri. So these are the points that you need to remember. Okay, simple है, अच्छा से पढ़ना. Chromosomal theory of inheritance. Okay, so next topic we will discuss linkage.